So here's a question nobody asks. What do you do when one of your oldest friends is Toomas Hendrik Ilves, the former president of Estonia, a European Union nation? I'll tell you what you do. You call him. A lot. My name's Andy Valver. I'm a comedian, American-born, now living in Europe because, well, if you could, wouldn't you? I grew up in the U.S., hearing stories from my parents about a country that didn't exist. At least not on any map you could buy because the Soviets had wiped it out. I only had one buddy who understood, Toomas. His parents were also Estonian, also refugees, and Toomas and I grew up sharing the same traditions, same weird Estonian Saturday school, and same conviction that America and Europe were family. And for most of our lives, they were. The alliance held until it didn't. Right now, the relationship that defined the free world for 80 years is coming apart, and Europe is scrambling to figure out who it is and what comes next. Toomas and I talk about this stuff, and it seems selfish to keep these conversations to myself. So here it is, the Continental Rift, with former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves and me, Andy Valver. Serious politics, questionable hosts. It's Thursday, the 20th of August, 35 years ago tonight, at 3 minutes past 11, while Soviet tanks were rolling towards its TV tower, the parliament of a small occupied country voted itself back into existence. One person who watched and reported on those events, later becoming that country's president, is conveniently on this show. This week on the Continental Rift, dependency, real, unavoidable, or just toxic? That's the thread running through this episode. For 35 years, Europe has run on borrowed sovereignty. American tech, American finance, American protection. The lender has started calling in the loans, and it all began with 3 days in August of 1991. Also this week, why Washington sent its NATO allies a questionnaire asking, in effect, do you love us? What happens when a reporter in Brussels tries to live for 72 hours without American technology and discovers that it's basically like living without any technology? And America put sanctions on the president of the International Criminal Court. Yes, America put sanctions on the criminal court. A judge from Japan whose offense is applying the law. Meanwhile, a U.S. aircraft carrier remains stuck at sea for 9 months because Iran blew up its supply base, which raises an awkward question about who really needs whose real estate. I'm Andy Valver, and with me is a man who watched those 3 days change everything before becoming foreign minister, and then two-time president, the former president of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves. Hey, Toomas.
Hi. Happy reestablishment of Independence Day. Yes.
Yes, reestablishment. It's pretty special. I mean, I remember, being an Estonian American, it was heady times. It was amazing stuff. I mean, my parents never thought they would live to see the day when Estonia was free again.
Well, yeah, there were heady days to be independent. On the other hand, Estonia was incredibly poor, backward. It had missed 50 years of development. So the past 35 years really has been devoted to catching up and, getting ahead in some areas of much of the world. But nonetheless, it was a trying time because once you had your de facto independence, then the question is, now what? What do we do now?
And where were you when this happened? Where were you still in Munich?
I was in Munich, but as soon as it happened, I flew in.
You did?
Yeah. Right
as
away.
A reporter or?
Yeah, as a reporter. And then after that, since I was head of the service, then the first democratically elected president started yelling at me, what the hell are you doing out there? Why don't you come here and do it yourself too, or help us do it? So, that was how I made the switch.
When I first visited you in Estonia back in 1997, and I looked at you and I said, what can I do? And you looked at me and said, move here. It's exactly what you said. Move here. And I went, but I've got a career in New York and I'm doing things. But you very distinctly said, I should have listened to you. But,
Well,
woulda, shoulda, coulda.
You shoulda, yeah. But
Yeah. No, I know. Anyway, let's move on a bit because we're going to talk more about the putsch and all that stuff in a minute. As I mentioned at the top, the United States sanctioned the president of the International Criminal Court for applying international law. Normally, when America wants a judge to stop applying the law, it appoints them to the Supreme Court. So, I think I almost got a smile out of you. Almost got a smile. Tomoko Akane, who is the Japanese head of the International Criminal Court, is wanted in Moscow and sanctioned in Washington, D.C., which is about as close as international law gets to a 5-star review.
Or being a European.
Or being a European. Yeah, exactly. So what's the deal here? I mean, I saw Rubio talking about this. Why are we doing this?
Well, we need to talk about how the ICC was created, which was in the aftermath of some of the horrible crimes against humanity in Bosnia, in Rwanda. There was a need to actually establish a way of having international jurisdiction to prosecute these crimes. And in fact, the United States was instrumental in helping set it up, though it did not become a member. And they said, well, we're not going to really join that.
We'll provide the clubhouse.
But in any case, the ICC, or International Criminal Court, has been responsible actually for convictions and sentences of real war criminals. So it serves a real function. However, the United States is opposed to this. Well, first of all, because they have indicted people like Benjamin Netanyahu, which doesn't really appeal to the U.S. And there's an ongoing thing with some other people who are American. So the whole point of Americans' objection to this is they are worried that American military will be subject to external jurisdiction
for acts they've committed in whatever theater they're active in.
But the outright hostility began with the return of President Trump.
A man who does not like the court system.
So he sues a lot, but when the U.S. sanctions someone, what that means is you cannot have access to anything that uses American technology or uses American currency. So suddenly these people found themselves without Visa, without MasterCard, without a Google or an Apple account. I mean, suddenly you're nowhere. Now this week they sanctioned the president of the ICC, a very respected Japanese jurist, and we'll see if this also amounts to the kind of cutoff to all access to any services that the U.S. is a dominant power in. The Europeans,
what did they say?
President of the Council, Antonio Costa, together with von der Leyen, said they stand firmly with the president of the ICC, President Akane, and whose judges, quote, must be able to act independently and without external pressure. Of course, on the other hand, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the ICC is a corrupt and fatally politicized supranational court, and the whole idea was to dismantle the ICC, which, like many other things, including the European Union, originally was a U.S. idea.
Has the European Union ever criticized the ICC? I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
It hasn't. And then again, you always say that the European Union is wimpy. Well, one of the outcomes of wimpiness is that Europeans have not committed war crimes.
I don't think wimpy is the way we should. I prefer the term well-mannered.
Yeah. Okay. Well, when President Akane issued a arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, Russia responded by opening a criminal case against her and placing her on its wanted list. So now she's, as you said, wanted in Moscow and sanctioned in Washington, which is kind of an index of where we are today. But when they did this previously to a judge, basically sentenced to what people called a civil death. That was, you don't have Microsoft Mail, Gmail,
Nothing.
iCloud. You just switch the judge off. And it's like, nope.
Which takes me to the next topic, and that is that a Politico reporter actually did this for a story. They went cold turkey on American technology for 72 hours. He gave up Apple, Google, WhatsApp, Visa, and MasterCard. And 12 hours later, he was declared missing.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the digital era, so being a missing person, in my case, I get messages if I haven't tweeted in 12 hours and people say, are you okay?
But it's true. I mean, everything you're saying, it's Europe's digital sovereignty strategy is currently stored on Microsoft's cloud.
Okay, first of all, I have to say that the journalist is from Politico, give credit where credit is due.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the two events within just a couple of days of each, the story and then the sanctioning of the president bring home the absolute fear of Europe these days, given the power of U.S. technology and the kind of not quite predictable behavior of the United States these days.
Yeah.
What happens if the U.S. says, okay, we're angry at you, Europeans.
Click.
Right.
Yeah.
So this came up already earlier when it comes to U.S. military technology, when President Trump said that, well, we'll sell you our stuff and you better buy our stuff. But if you do buy our stuff, we may turn down its quality, so it's not as good for you.
Well, and there was a poll that said 74% of Europe's business leaders, 74% worry that a U.S. tech cutoff could disrupt their operations.
Well, it probably would. There are not enough people worried about this. It should be 100%, frankly, because we are so reliant here in 2026. We could be basically shut down. Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, was already saying last year, and I think it was after the first sanctions of the ICC judges, that we cannot depend on Visa and MasterCard. We need our own digital payment services. And in fact, the European Central Bank, or ECB, is working on that now. There have been efforts on the part of the Europeans to set up their own Zoom or sort of that kind of thing. It's off to a slow start.
Because people don't adopt it, they don't know about it, or it just doesn't work as well.
All three. Yeah. And so there's that. Then there are, there's an attempt to get a Starlink version, a European Starlink up, because that actually came about when Elon Musk shut off Starlink to the Ukrainians, and they of course are highly dependent upon Starlink. Right. But one more thing. Last week, the Turks finally sent all kinds of missiles to the Ukrainians, having received permission. Now, this is the crucial matter. You see all these over and over again. In order for a country that has bought military equipment from the United States, right, in order for it to give it away, or if it contains any U.S. components, you have to get permission from the United States to send it there.
Is that part of the fine print in a contract, or?
Well, it's known from the beginning, isn't it?
Okay. And this is why the Brits.
Yes, exactly. This week, the Brits said they are giving to the Ukrainians missiles that do not have any U.S. components.
So it's like, yeah, what are you going to do?
Well, this is where you are. And so there are two things that come out of it. First of all, it's not only the U.S., because there was this famous case 4 years ago when the Germans could not give a weapon to the Ukrainians because it had a Swiss component. And the Swiss at the time said, we don't give weapons to countries that are at war, which is like, well, then what do you need the weapons for?
We just store the money of the people that are at war.
But the bigger issue that comes in here, of course, is that you have this complete contradiction and sort of problem with the U.S. and Europe on these issues. Because, first of all, the United States has a domestic buy only American products. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Now the Europeans do this, a certain percentage of military purchases must be from Europeans, and the U.S. ambassador in Brussels has gone ballistic on this. But at the same time, if the U.S. can turn it off, why wouldn't people say, maybe we should do our own?
And even the Brits, who are nominally our best friends, or the U.S.'s best friends, kind of said, no, enough already.
And so what's happened now is that the Brits have prototypes of weapons that have no components from the United States. And they said they're going to give these to Ukraine, which immediately caused an avalanche of threats against the UK from the Russians. To sum up, basically, today, sovereignty is very different from the way it was in the 19th and 20th, most of the 20th century. It's a stack. Payments, clouds, models, munitions, and we're finding out slowly, but brutally, I would say, that sovereignty is much more than saying, these are my borders.
So Europe is learning that it can't trust U.S. technology. So the next question is can it still trust U.S. protection? Because according to a scoop from Bloomberg, the U.S. just sent its allies a sort of a loyalty test in writing. I mean, essentially, America turned NATO into a dating app. Do you support my wars? Will you let me use your place? Are you seeing other defense contractors?
Are we going steady or not?
That's right. Exactly. Can I get my ring back, please?
Well, first of all, it was not sent through NATO. It was sent bilaterally by the United States. With such questions such as, has the country been publicly supportive of U.S. foreign policy? The U.S. initiative, in quotes, the initiative in the Middle East, that is the Iran war, seizing Maduro, which frankly, people in Europe have been looked at that and say, in the case of Maduro, that's kind of like a violation of international law, but we'll be quiet. And in the case of Iran, basically, the U.S. did it without asking or telling anyone. They just went in, as we've said numerous times, and then got bashed for not being there already or something.
We're doing that a lot these days. We're spending euros without letting the Europeans know.
So to put this in context, the U.S. is undergoing a long-announced, quote, force posture review for Europe. And we've talked about this before. How many troops do we want to keep there? What kind of armaments does the U.S. want in Europe? And so forth. It was begun last month and it should be done by December. But in the context of a force posture review, you sent out this loyalty test to see what each country is going to do. It's a way of, it's a strong arming Europe to have ideological alignment in exchange for protection from the United States. And that certainly is not what NATO has ever been about.
This is how the mob works in Brooklyn.
Yeah, we said that last week too. This is more like in New Jersey.
Okay.
Brooklyn's a lot more sort of low key these days.
Yeah,
Everyone's sipping lattes. Right?
Lattes, yeah. The U.S. is just doing what they do. They don't care. I mean, look, bases are important. Look, I mean, the big glaring example right now is the USS President Abraham Lincoln, which is the carrier that cannot go back. It's been stuck at sea for 260 days. I mean, even Carnival Cruise lets you off at a certain point.
Well, I mean, the problem is deeper. I think it has to do with the quality of food, but which is apparently very bad. The quality
but they
of
also
living conditions.
They blew up their base. The Iranians blew up the base.
Well, it's turning into a domestic issue there because the soldiers are talking to or writing to their wives, girlfriends, mothers.
Right.
And so it's becoming kind of a hot button item there. I mean, carriers already are a tough place to be because you're there with 5,000 other people cramped in this kind of metal sort of thing. And then I guess, people do get stir crazy. And this is certainly not a Carnival cruise.
So if American power projection into the Middle East depends on European and allied real estate, and Bahrain showed what happens without it, will we ever see the flow reverse? I mean, European nations charging the U.S. for access?
No, I don't see that. I mean, at least not with this administration. Basically, if anyone starts
They'd
doing
go ballistic. They go ballistic, wouldn't
they? They say, "Okay, we leave. Bye."
That's it. That's boom. That's it.
So I don't see that happening. But for 75 years, it was a mutual understanding. Yeah, you use our bases, but you will protect us. This was certainly the case with the various wars that the U.S. has engaged in. I mean, it was the first Gulf War. Everybody was there. Then it was Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, France and Germany on Iraq were less helpful, but basically it was like you need our bases. We pay for the bases. Go ahead. And that's kind of part of the understood deal.
Let's move on to our main topic, which is the putsch. We are recording on the 20th of August. And 35 years ago to the day, there was the putsch in Moscow. Now, for our younger listeners, Thomas, can you fill us in what happened?
1986, we got a new Communist Party General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, who started with some slow reforms. And so you started getting people talking about things that you couldn't talk about in the Soviet Union before. I mean, it got to the point where the Soviet Union was a good deal more liberal than Putin is today, who puts you in jail immediately. For a while there, if you use the word war, you would be put in jail. But right now, any criticism, it's either like jail, window,
tea,
or minimally for getting fired. Okay, so but what happened was then in 1989, you saw like the outer empire, Poland went, and Czechoslovakia at the time went. East Germany went, and people started getting a little worried about it. The communists started getting a little worried about where's this going. And then, but Gorbachev remained firm, and he continued to liberalize with things such as you could have little shops now. You could sell things in your little shop. And then his hardliners, as it were really annoyed, and they decided that enough of this. And so when Gorbachev in August of 1991 was on vacation.
What were they annoyed about? I mean, what were the...
they just thought this was destroying communism, and they were really, this is like the KGB, the military. I mean, they were just looking at this saying, this is really bad news. We can't have people protesting.
This is the road to hell, basically.
Right. And so they locked him up in southern Russia and declared a coup, and it would send tanks into Moscow. And then parts of the Union that were especially uppity, mainly Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they sent in military. So then all these tanks poured into the three countries. It was at that point that here in Estonia we said, no, this is no putsch. So the Soviet army was trying to take over the TV tower, which is like classic Lenin, get the communication centers. Right. And there was like all these sort of struggles between Estonians and Russian troops. And then the parliament met, and the parliament, it was a Soviet-style parliament. They voted to declare independence, which then everything followed from that. Boris Yeltsin recognized the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and it's got into a whole big mess in Moscow. We were already out of it, leading to Boris Yeltsin, who had been elected president of Russia in an equally weird parliament, but nonetheless, he was president of Russia. And so he basically declared the Soviet Union over, finito, basta. And so on the 25th of December, Christmas Day, the Soviet Union just went poof.
Just ceased to exist.
Yes.
And so, which leads me to the next part of this all, which is we talked about there was this peace dividend, right?
Yes. President Herbert Walker Bush, Bush Sr., said, okay, the Cold War is over, and now we don't have to spend all this money on defense, and this is the great peace dividend. And what that meant in Europe was that everyone said, oh, okay, we're not going to spend that much money anymore. I mean, just to give you an example, in the 1980s, Germany was spending 4% of its GDP on defense, which, kind of made sense if you got your country's divided in half. On the other side of the border are
right.
Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. And so this followed across at least Western Europe. Said, okay, no more. We're going to put that money into social welfare because we don't have to worry about,
right.
communism. And there was this fundamental misunderstanding that I think has lasted to this day in some quarters, both in the US and in Europe, that, well, no more communism means the default condition is democracy. If you know your history of Europe, the 1930s, the fascists were not communists, but they were not democracies. And in fact, today we can see that Russia is a very capitalist country, yet it is hardly a democracy.
So if the USSR had not collapsed, no one could complain about European defense spending, right?
Right. This is the bizarre moment. This is especially tough if you're from one of the countries that was occupied. But I mean, in fact, the Europeans would have continued to spend money on defense, but we, on the other hand, would continue to be occupied. So,
trade-offs.
Yeah.
All right. So basically, NATO's 2026 estimate, the top three spenders by share of GDP are Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. The three countries that never believed the peace dividend was permanent are the three paying the most.
Right. Well, because the peace dividend, always struck us as being kind of wishful thinking. When the 2% requirement was announced, in 2011, that was when I was in office. That was one of my big things, constantly saying, Finance Minister, we need 2%. And they agreed. Now we're going to be hitting 5.3% in 2027, which is getting really up there. But you're a frontline state. Here you are bordering them. So what are you going to do?
So the Soviet Union is gone. Communism is gone. But the game continues to this day, right? I mean, the GRU is doing all sorts of stuff everywhere. The most glaring example, there's a Le Carré novel called The Russia House. And it turns out that Berlin kept the film set because the Russian State Cultural Center on Friedrichstrasse, which has been going since 1984, and according to French intelligence, it's not about ballet recitals.
According to French intelligence, about a place in Germany.
Let's call it what it is. Russia says it's a cultural center, but Berlin says it's allegedly used by Russian intelligence. Apparently, the cultural program includes ballet, literature, and destabilizing Western democracy.
It probably is, given experience with these things. There is a heavy overlap between, was already during the Soviet period, between cultural organizations and the KGB. So now, I mean, the overlap continues. There is this push to get rid of this house, but other people, the hard right and the hard left, AfD and the BSV, or BSW in English, they're saying, no, this is all cultural exchange. I mean, the context of this also is last week's drone attack on Leipzig, right? I mean,
yes.
I mean, what we call that misnomer we have attacked here constantly, the hybrid war. I mean, it's because it covers everything, and it covers
everything. Right. Yeah. So apparently the department responsible for secure telecommunications in Germany will work right next door to the Russian listening post. So at least the Wi-Fi will be excellent. So anyway, but you talked about the hybrid attacks and stuff. The 13th of August, there was a drone incursion in Romania. On the 13th of August, a powerful explosion at an ammunition factory near Rome. Right? I mean, that's really, that's not even on the border.
Following one a week before in Bulgaria.
Right, exactly. And on the 14th and the 15th of August, there was apparently a suspected arson at the Milrem Robotics in Tallinn, Estonia. And on the 16th of August, a drone was shot down over Romanian airspace by a Spanish F-18. Do they have a schedule? I mean, is there... Does it go? So, what haven't we hit? Let's just send something up. How about the Netherlands? Let's do something there.
Oh, they've done that.
A
while back. I was a while back.
Yeah, right.
I mean, Italy has been kind of spared up till now. It does have one effect, which is that at least some people in Europe are getting really annoyed. So we see Kaja Kallas is proposing now the most far-reaching sanctions listings since the start of the Ukrainian war.
Right.
And so, according to Reuters, some 1,600 people and entities. And, well, we'll see how it goes, because the other side of this is that it's been increasingly difficult to get agreement in the European Council about anything proposed by the Commission on dealing with Russia. And so it's going to be a real tangle, and we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Well, on that note, 35 years ago tonight, a small country decided sovereignty is something that you build, not something you borrow. Its neighbors now top NATO's spending table. Everyone else is still reading the questionnaire.
And unless that had happened 35 years ago, we would not be having this podcast, and I would not be here in Estonia with the Estonian, NATO, and EU flag behind me in my office. All that started 35 years ago, was set into motion. We were friends long before that, but here we are.
Here we are doing what we do. Anyway, Tomas, thank you again so much. And I really appreciate, I love hearing your memories about all this stuff because, you were there. I was still in the US, but you were right on the front line. So that's really, really cool. And to our audience, I want to thank you for joining us here on the Continental Rift. We know that your time is valuable, so we really appreciate you spending some of your time with us. The Continental Rift is hosted by Thomas Hendrik Ilves and me, Andy Valver. The Continental Rift is a Fresh Lens production. All rights are reserved. We'll see you again next week.